at least on the internet, people are behaving as if Skynet is literally around the corner. And as per usual, we seem very optimistic about our worst fears. What's been most interesting to me, though, is that there's suddenly all of these interviews with people who are building these systems, engineers, and they're kind of not denying that we are really close to building conscious machines. However, the peculiar thing is that we don't even fully understand what consciousness is, and yet we are confidently predicting that we're just about to create one from scratch. What I'm missing in these debates is people like you, researchers who actually have an idea of what consciousness might be. So I suppose my first question to you has to be this. Do you think it's possible to create something so complex without really understanding it in the first place? Can consciousness just arise spontaneously on its own? Like, let's say we release ChatGPT 11 and it's so smart it's suddenly aware of itself.
Well, there are actually two questions there. I think for the first one, it's indeed possible for us to build things that we don't fully understand. I think these ChatGPT algorithms are examples of that. People don't fully understand how they do what they do and why they sometimes do quite strange things. We can get onto that. The second question about whether this means that consciousness might spontaneously appear in GPT-11 or GPT-600, that's a different thing. And I don't see any prospect for that at all. And the reason is that there's a distinction which is surprisingly little made in all the debate about artificial intelligence and about these large language models, which is that intelligence is not the same thing as consciousness. And for us humans, we tend to think it goes together. And I think that's a residue of our human exceptionalism, this tendency to put ourselves at the center of things and at the top of every pile. We think we're smart and we know we're conscious. So there's this idea kind of baked in there that as artificial systems get smarter and smarter, that at some point the lights come on and consciousness just comes along for the ride. I just don't think this is likely at all. It makes a lot of assumptions. Firstly, that there's this association between the two. Secondly, and I think most importantly, that consciousness is the kind of thing that computers could have. And this is just not known. I mean, there are some things that computers do which actually generates the thing in question. A computer that's playing chess actually is playing chess. But a computer that's simulating, let's say, a weather system, it doesn't actually ever get wet or windy inside that computer. It's always just a simulation. And so the question that I think is still open, is consciousness more like chess or is it more like the weather? And the prevailing view has been that it's more like chess, that consciousness is some kind of information processing, that if you program a computer right, it will happen. But that's a massive assumption. And my research and my way of thinking has tended to suggest the opposite, that consciousness is a biological phenomenon. It's fundamentally related to our nature as living, embodied, flesh and blood creatures. And from that perspective, in order to get conscious AI, one first has to have living machines. And even GPT 6000 is not going to be alive.
What about like a replicant from Blade Runner? A machine that has a body and some sort of maybe organic matter or something along those lines. Could that have
much more interesting? Well, yes. And once we go into the realm of science fiction, then a lot more things come on the table. And actually, of course, science fiction has done a much better job than most professional commentators on trying to tease apart these things.
Oof,
Blade Runner is an extraordinary examination of the role of emotion and embodiment in consciousness and selfhood. So it prioritizes emotion in a way that other perspectives have tended to overlook. There's this, we're so familiar with the Turing test, and there's all these ideas now that ChatGPT makes the Turing test redundant. It passes it because the Turing test being this test of machine intelligence, right? So can you as a human tell a difference between interacting with a human or interacting with a machine. I think most people still can when it comes to ChatGPT, but maybe GPT 6 few down the road that'll change. Blade Runner had this thing called the Voight-Kampff test, and this is a test about emotional reactivity. Does a person, if you're trying to decide whether such and such is a replicant or a person, do they have the right emotional responses? And I think that's much closer to the nub of things when it comes to consciousness. So maybe, that's, I think, much more plausible, that once you have a system that is both embodied, so it actually interacts with its environment, that's also something that's lacking from large language models, which is why they don't understand anything, let alone be conscious of anything. Understanding requires, in my view, interaction with an environment. It's that grounding of symbols in sensory motor flow that gives our words meaning. So maybe a large language model that is embedded in a robot that actually interacts with an environment, or that is learning during the process of interacting with the environment, that could maybe understand, but it still might not be conscious. But then bringing in physiology, bringing in the capacity for emotion, bringing in basically the imperative that the system has to keep itself alive. Now, I think that is going to be a difference that makes a difference.
I think you referenced Daniel Dennett in the book when he says these are intelligent tools, not our colleagues. Right? At least so far.
I think his comment, it's a beautiful phrase. He advises us years ago. I mean, this is not a new thing. He's not just responding to the current wave of frenzy, as you nicely put it. He advises us to always remember that we're building tools, not colleagues, when we're thinking about these artificial systems. And I think that's never been more relevant than now. Part of the problem in how we're grappling with the emergence of large language models is this idea that they might be very similar to us, that how are we going to coexist with them? How are they going to contribute rather than be dangerous for society? And it is important to remember that just like a search engine is a tool, just like a piece of paper and a pen is a tool, a large language model can be a tool. It can be very good for some things and horrendously bad at other things. And to the extent that we keep projecting mind into these things, we're very anthropomorphic people. We can't resist often projecting mind and consciousness into things that seem similar to us in some way. And actually, I think that's the much more likely scenario. It's not that large language models will actually be conscious. It's that we will be unable to resist attributing them with conscious minds, in much the same way that certain visual illusions, even though we know what's going on, we can't help seeing the illusion. We'd be susceptible to a kind of cognitive illusion that large language models have minds, when in fact they don't. And it's recognizing that that will allow us to better treat these things as tools rather than colleagues.
Speaking of ChatGPT, I have a little confession to make. I typed, "What should I ask Professor Anil Seth about AI?" into ChatGPT. Of course, I couldn't help myself. I kind of thought it would be only fair that I let it ask you a question about itself. It came up with a dozen questions, most of them pretty boring, to be honest. But I thought this one was kind of interesting. So I'll have a go. Some experts have suggested that AI could eventually lead to a post-human era in which humans and machines merge into a single entity. What is your perspective on this possibility? Are there any ethical or philosophical implications that we should consider here?
Well done, ChatGPT. That's a good. By the way, did that come from GPT-4? Which version of GPT did that
GPT-4.
come from?
That was literally today. Yeah.
That was today. I mean, this is one of the interesting things that the rate of progress in these large language models is very impressive. GPT-4 is so much better than previous iterations.
I did have to give another command because at the beginning he was asking really generic, boring questions,
Right.
and then I think I said, "Can you ask something a little bit more daring?" And then this came out.
Yes, that's one of the great things you can do. You can push it in different directions. I noticed you said he rather than it. I keep thinking of them as it to try.
Of course, yeah.
Again, remember, it's a tool, not a colleague.
Right. Thank you. I need that.
But for the question itself, this idea of a kind of post-human era when we merge with machines, in a sense, that's already happened. I think that's been happening for a long time. My colleague and friend Andy Clark, a philosopher, talks a lot about the extended mind. The idea that the boundary of our mind is not at the skull. It takes in all the things, or not all the things, but many of the things we interact with, pen and paper, but certainly a lot of my memory is on my smartphone already. And a lot of my cognitive ability, I would say, is not in my head anymore. It's in search engines, it's in all sorts of other things. So there's a sense in which this trajectory of merging with machines is already underway, but it hasn't reached the point where we become a single entity. I'm not entirely sure what that would mean. I do think it's not just a case of increasingly useful and potentially dangerous machine learning systems. There are, of course, more direct ways in which we are entering this so-called post-human realm. People can have neural implants. Elon Musk is working on Neuralink and things like this, which can directly introduce non-biological components into our brains. Of course, outside our brains, this is no longer a controversial thing. We have artificial limbs. We have all sorts of things that help us. But at what point does this constitute becoming post-human? I'm not really sure what that would mean. I don't see that as a particularly imminent prospect, but I do see sort of increasing integration between humankind and various forms of technology that undoubtedly will pose a lot of ethical challenges. There are lots of just, I think, quite prosaic but very important ethical issues about accessibility and equity. What about lifespan? Are we able to use technology to extend life? Until now, the fact that most people die within a few decades of each other is a great equalizer. And if that's suddenly off the table, then I think society is in a lot of trouble. By the way, I have to say, I also, like everybody, have been playing with GPT. And I asked GPT-4 to write a biography of myself and some other friends. And what I was struck by there was how it combined generic things that were true with very specific things that were wrong. So it got where I did my PhD wrong. It got my birthday and place wrong. And it got them wrong in a way which was a little surprising, because these facts that it was suggesting were not online anywhere else. They were just wrong. And a lot of people say that large language models hallucinate. I rather think they confabulate. And hallucination is a kind of false perception.
Right.
Confabulation, something we see in neurology, is in certain conditions, psychiatric conditions or neurological conditions, people just seamlessly make stuff up, fill in gaps in a way they're not even aware of doing. And for me, that's much more redolent of what large language models do. They just make stuff up, and they don't know the difference between making stuff up and saying stuff that's correct, because they don't actually know anything. I don't think there's any understanding there at all. And what really betrayed that for me was when I asked the GPT-4, a bit like you, saying, ask something a bit more daring. I said, write the bio again, but this time more accurately, without so many errors in dates and places. And I thought that the system might be able to respond either by fixing the errors or by becoming more generic in those places where it had made errors, like saying just born in the UK rather than born in London, which was wrong. I wasn't born in London. was born in Oxford. But instead it said, born in Hammersmith, London, which is even more specific and therefore even more likely to be wrong. And it invented a whole new career stage for me in Germany, where I've never worked. So it's just, I think this, whenever you see something that says, oh my gosh, these systems, theory of mind just emerges when you train them on enough data, and they get into this weird so-called interpolation regime where we don't quite know what's happening. So these things emerge like theory of mind. There'll be some other domain where they're still revealed as, the unkind phrase as being a kind of stochastic parrot. They can make errors which betray a total lack of what we think needs to be going on in order to do this kind of thing. They don't have, in this case, any kind of metacognition, the ability to know when they are right or wrong and do something about it. So yes, there's a long way to go, even for GPT-4.
Right. I asked it to tell me about myself, and it said, I don't know this person. So my vanity was immediately offended, and I was like, that's enough of you. You mentioned Elon Musk. I have to preface this by saying that I'm not a huge fan of the man, but I wanted to ask, what do you think of the open letter that he signed, among other people, and that says, or it calls on all AI labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. It was also signed by Steve Wozniak, Andrew Yang, and thousands of other people and researchers. What do you think of this petition?
I was one of the thousands of others. I also put my name to that. And so I think it's important, and I think there are a number of reasons for. I think it's first thing to say is with so many signatories on it, it's you can't expect that every signatory agrees with every part of the letter, and I wouldn't write the same letter. I don't agree with every part, but I think it's trying to make an important point, and it's a point that needs to be made right now. And there are a few reasons. I mean, probably the most significant reason is that the acceleration in the power and potential of these systems is taking everybody by surprise. It's taking by surprise those people in the business as well as those people on the outside of it. It is changing things. It can be used to generate enormous amounts of misinformation, disinformation, biased information. These are problems that are already here. I mean, and then there are a whole raft of problems. I think the more sort of existential problems about what happens if these systems are given the ability to make decisions, to control things. It is concerning because, as we've just been discussing with these biographies, they're kind of amusing, but they get things very wrong, and we have very little understanding of why they get things wrong, why they sometimes get things right. They're very unreliable. And in my kind of most of my research, let's say in psychology and neuroscience, if you're going to do an experiment, you've got to go through a pretty rigorous ethics application process before you do your experiment on people. These large language models are vast experiments on human society. And it's not really asking all that much that there should be some regulation of how these things are done, because this already happens in so many other areas. And so we're not, the 6 month pause, I think for me, that's more just an attention grabbing thing. I don't think anybody seriously expects that to happen. But the point of the letter is not for that specific thing to be the case. But for me anyway, it's to raise this issue further up the news agenda and have it discussed not only by scientists and not only by people in tech, but by people in the humanities, by people in sociology, by people in politics, because these are issues for which I'm not sure the scientists and technocrats will have the best answer. I mean, it's something that affects the whole of society, and the debate therefore needs to go beyond the confines of Silicon Valley and the ivory tower.
All right. Thank you to my lovely patrons, Taichi, Carmen, And Veronica, thank you for your support. You're amazing. If you want to support Eurotrash too, you can do that. Just go to Patreon and find me there. Right. Thanks again.